Hey folks, got another one of these lovely big jumbos from Takamine, Maple Back. You've seen it before. So I wanted to talk today, I want to do another music themed video for a change. One of the things that drives me to be an instrument worker and to dabble in this trade, the biggest thing is a love of music. And I've mentioned it on a couple of threads and I don't want to lose sight of it. I'm an absolute music nut. For 10 years I worked as a guest presenter on a British radio show that featured probably thousands of little known bands, musicians, composers, that kind of stuff. I spend a lot of time researching music as much as I do musical instruments, and I go down what we know as rabbit holes in doing so, and sometimes get lost for weeks at a time in a dark, distant corner of the music world. So I just wrote down 10 rabbit holes I've been down in the last couple of years or so that have completely consumed me. I thought you might find it interesting. Music is so vast, and there's so much to explore all the time. So number one, for an entire 2-month period of my life, I listened to nothing but English Tudor period, Elizabethan, Tudor, Henry VIII's court as well. Viol consort music. I got absolutely consumed by it. Viols are what preceded the violin family, and they've been brought back with the early music movement. And you can find a lot of those compositions and recordings that you couldn't listen to, 30, 40 years ago. I'm talking about the composers like William Byrd, Orlando Gibbons, William Laws, Anthony Holborn. There's a slew of them. And the drony quality of viol consort music, while being stately and elegant, is just something otherworldly. And I got completely hooked on it. From there, I went into solo viol music of the next century, mostly French. So it was one of those rabbit holes that I was down for 2 months. That was exciting. I'm a big fan of the band Dead Can Dance, so I explore something called neoclassical dark wave. There's a lot of it. It's more popular in Europe. There's a lot of neoclassical dark wave or dark folk, sometimes it's called. Bands like Irfan, Elent, Vas. Dead Can Dance, of course, is the main component of that. It's sort of a often funereal, often string-based, elegiac kind of music. It's dark, it's somber, but it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. If you know Dead Can Dance, you'll know what I'm talking about. And there are lots of other bands, mostly from European countries, that are in this world, and it's just a wonderful music to explore, especially if you're a string player. I'm a cellist, so that kind of music appeals to me now and again. I spent a good month or so just exploring the Ethereal Jazz of the ECM record company. Started out with people like Ralph Towner and John Abercrombie, graduated to David Torn and Serge Ripdahl. Just an amazing stable of musicians at ECM, and that sort of very understated ethereal jazz is unlike anything else in the jazz world. It probably starts with things like Miles Davis' Sketches of Spain, almost sort of a classical feel to it. The famous concerts in Cologne, the Cologne Concerts album, was one of the great early releases of ECM, and it's projected from there. It's a whole other world. I know other people that have put videos out that have got, sort of trapped in that world for years at a time. It's never ending. There are thousands of recordings. ECM also has some really wonderful, little known underground kind of classical releases as well, and that's fun to explore. I wasn't big on 70s music until recently. I've been sort of rediscovering movements in the 70s, one of which is early British 70s psych folk, or sometimes referenced as acid folk. Started with the wonderful First Utterance album from Comus. If you haven't heard it, it's just absolutely amazing. Bands like Spyro Gyra, not the Californian light jazz Spyro Gyra. It's the original 70s folk band. The Trees. There are a lot of them. Really interesting. The Garden of Jane Delaunay is just a wonderful album from the Trees. But there are lots of these kind of chill, early ethereal folk, mostly from Britain. You do get other countries that are involved there as well. That I really like, and it's the trippier element of it, the more psychedelic element that I like. I mean, the incredible string band and some of the other more popular the folk rock groups are interesting, but I really like these more ethereal bands. Like Renaissance is another one. Very piano based, very classical, old English folk. Another thing I discovered from the 70s, I got into prog rock for a while. Of course, all the big bands like King Crimson and Genesis, and uh, there's a ton of them out there. I mean, I'm blanking out at the moment, but my God, there's lots of prog rock, and I like the probably the more experimental side of that. There's some awfully cheesy, like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and they took it in a sort of a cheesy neoclassical direction that I didn't always like. But there are just some amazing bands in Britain, the first wave British folk rock. But once you start exploring the following movements in France and Italy, you can get into some really, really obscure stuff that's just fantastic. In Italy, you have PCM, Primo, what is it, something Marconi, Goblin, Museo Rosenbach, who did a great recording of Zarathustra in the 70s. Then you go to France and you find the one and only Magma, just a listening experience that is unlike anything else on earth. And of course, you have to learn to speak Kobayan, which is a created language of alien peoples. Zool music, it's called. And then Gong, another just unique French prog experience that's lasted for years. You can take that into Germany and explore 70s krautrock. Horrible label, sometimes referred to as Komisch music, and you know the big bands: Can, Neu, Faust, Armandul, Kraftwerk, if you want the more electronic wing of it. That's a whole world unto itself, and there are literally hundreds of lesser known releases, and so much fun exploring in that area of the world in the early 70s, which had a massive influence on more popular bands in the late 70s and early 80s. Getting back to the classical world, I really love string quartets. It's one of my favorite mediums for classical music. I like the sparseness, the space, the texture of just the four instruments. I like chamber music in general, which is smaller ensembles. And there are a number of experimental string quartets that explore really the experimental, often living composers side of classical music. The two most famous are the Kronos Quartet, and they probably have 20, 30 albums, and the Arditi Quartet are the two most well known. And between them, they bring alive music you would never ever hear. Obscure, poor, down and out living composers who can't get their music played because the classical world persists with Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms. But there are people that are trying to bring out newer elements, more experimental, avant-garde elements of classical music, and it really, for some reason, it just really works in the chamber music world, particularly with string quartets. So that was a rabbit hole I went down for a while. Um, I grew up in the 80s when I first started playing in bands. I was really into stuff like The Cure and Bauhaus and the Mission UK. That sort of, we called it goth rock or death rock back then. Now there are more clear distinctions between those. But basically, goth music of the early 80s. What they call goth today doesn't sound anything like it, and I think they're sort of stealing and misappropriating that label somewhat. I can't listen to screamo and stuff like that, even if they wear black clothes and dress like their earlier counterparts. For me, it's just not the same experience. But when you go back into the post-punk era, the earliest Susie and the Banshees albums, the earliest Cure albums, and then you look at all of the lesser-known bands from that time, there's a treasure trove of stuff to get into. It's just amazing what you can find. Little-known bands like Alien Sex Fiend, and well, they're not little known in that world, but there's just tons of stuff to listen to. That sort of dark. Often biting music, and I'm thinking of Bauhaus's first album, In Flat Fields, that sort of sound that is done by a lot of other bands, lesser known bands that have sort of disappeared, and you can find them in places like YouTube, Spotify, if you go that route. So that's kind of fun to go back into that world and explore sort of the very early 80s. It's amazing that the really early 70s were so fertile with creative music, and then it tapers off in the late 70s a little bit. Same with the early 80s. You get such an explosion of underground dark wave kind of music, and then it sort of tapers off towards the end of the 80s when people start listening to bands like Guns N' Roses. But still, in the late 80s, you got the Cocteau Twins and things like that. So actually, they're early 80s as well. But there's the whole 4AD thing, which is kind of fun in the late 80s. Going back to early music, and I'm a big early music enthusiast, as you can tell by some of the instruments behind me. I love to explore early compositions for vihuela and baroque guitar. They wrote down some of the composers: Milan, Naves, Mudura, Pisador, all of the early Spanish composers that wrote music for the earliest versions of guitars before Torres brought out invented the modern classical guitar. So they were quieter, more dainty, more fragile instruments, and the music reflects the difference in the earlier versions of guitar making compared with the late versions. There's a great video. It's a 70s video, so it's kind of grainy, but there's a great video of Julian Bream playing sort of giving you the history of Spanish music, all the way from the early vihuela compositions through the Baroque guitar compositions into the modern, more well-known period. And he plays all those period instruments on the video. It's like a 2-hour video. It's great fun, and you really learn a lot, and then you can follow up your explorations that way. I'm not just about guitar. I have a confession to make. I really love old synthesizer music. I've always been interested in synthesizers used in sort of the more esoteric way of the late 60s and early 70s, before Keith Emerson came along and sort of turned them into a modern organ kind of thing, a Rick Wakeman too. But I like the stuff before that, going back to Tomita and the early Vangelis recordings, Jean-Michel Jarre's Equinox and Oxygene, Klaus Schultz. And once you get into the early Tangerine Dream, and once you get into that world, you find all kinds of unknown underground. I found a whole collection of early French synthesizer music. Dominique Guillot is one of them. that's absolutely fantastic, really, really cool. That's now just sort of, a lot of it's getting reissued and put out. You couldn't find these recordings, but now they're getting reissued by small labels. So that's a fun world. Early European psychedelic slash space electronic music before sequencers came in and automated electronic music and basically turned it into a dance medium. There's some great lush symphonic works done with synthesizers that I really love. Just sort of gelling to them at night when I'm reading or something is great fun. So there's a list of 10 rabbit holes that I've been down. There are many, many more. I'm already thinking of more as I'm sitting here talking, but I don't want to take this video too much further. But I just want to assure people out there, I'm not just somebody who gets into the nuts and bolts of working on instruments. It's the music behind all these instruments that compels me more than anything else. And I am a real audiophile, a collector of vinyl, and a lover of the tactile music experience, even though I stream it as well. You know, it's that world really for me that drives my passion for musical instruments as well as live performing. You know, the great treasure trove of little known recordings that you can dive into and just get lost for days. Anyway, just thought I'd share that. Have a great day, and I'll see you with more instruments.